A human's blind date with an alien military woman and her 6 daughters turned out deadly serious. The man walked into the quiet hall with no clear idea of what was waiting for him. He had been told it was a blind date, something arranged by a friend who said it would be different from anything he had known before. He expected a quiet evening, maybe laughter, maybe an awkward silence, but nothing more than that. The lights were dim, the walls lined with strange patterns he had never seen before, as if the place was built for someone who did not think like a human. He sat down at the long table, and his hand trembled slightly as he touched the cold surface. It was not wood, it was not metal, it was something alien. The door opened and she entered. She was not just a woman. She was tall, armored, and every movement spoke of discipline. Her eyes burned like fire hidden beneath calm waters. The air around her felt heavy, as if her very presence could push down on his chest. She was not dressed for romance, she was dressed for war. He swallowed hard, suddenly unsure if this was a mistake, if he should leave before it was too late. But his legs refused to move. Behind her came 6 younger figures, each of them with the same sharp features, the same controlled way of walking, and the same piercing gaze. They stood close to her, silent, their eyes locked on him as if he were prey. The man felt his throat dry, his pulse racing. This was not a date. This was a trial. She sat across from him, her armor clinking softly as she moved. For a long moment she did not speak. She simply watched him, her eyes unblinking, her daughters standing like shadows at her side. He tried to smile, but the smile broke on his lips. He could not read her, could not guess what she wanted. The silence grew heavier, pressing into the walls, pressing into his chest. Finally she spoke, her voice deep and commanding. She asked his name. He gave it, though his voice cracked slightly. She asked why he had come, and he said it was for the date. The daughters exchanged looks, cold smiles flickering on their faces. It felt like mockery. She asked what he wanted from this night, and he answered with honesty, saying he had only wanted to meet someone, to share a simple evening. Her eyes narrowed at that answer. The table was not set with food. It was set with objects he could not recognize, shining tools of metal and crystal, things that hummed faintly when touched by the light. They looked more like weapons than decorations. He leaned back in his seat, his body tense, every instinct screaming to run. Yet something deeper inside told him not to. If he left, he might never understand why he had been brought here. One of the daughters stepped forward. She asked him if he feared them. He looked at her, and though his heart pounded in his chest, he said no. She tilted her head, her eyes narrow with doubt. Another daughter asked if he could fight, if he could protect, if he could stand in front of danger without breaking. He hesitated, then nodded. The air shifted again, heavier, more dangerous. The mother leaned forward, her gaze sharp. She asked him what he thought of war. He struggled for words, but he spoke the truth. That war was brutal, that war was survival, that sometimes war was the only way to protect what mattered. The daughters whispered among themselves, voices like the hiss of knives sliding from their sheaths. He felt every whisper cutting at his nerves, but he did not look away. He held his ground. A sudden sound broke the air. One of the daughters slammed her hand against the table, and in a swift motion she pulled a blade from her side. The man froze, staring at the weapon, its edge glowing faintly with strange energy. She pointed it at him and asked if he would still sit there if death stood in front of him. He looked at her, at the weapon, at the cold fire in her eyes. His chest burned with fear, but his voice came steady when he said yes. The mother smiled for the first time. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of someone who had seen courage tested and had found it rare. She leaned back in her seat, her eyes never leaving his. She said nothing more, but the silence that followed carried more weight than words. The man sat still, his heart racing, knowing now with absolute certainty that he was not there for romance, not there for love. This was not a blind date. This was something else. A judgment. A trial of flesh and spirit, and he had no choice but to see it through. The silence stretched longer than any man could endure, yet he forced himself to stay seated, his body stiff but unbroken. The alien woman watched him with unblinking focus as if she was weighing his very soul. Around her the 6 daughters shifted slightly, but their eyes never left him. He realized they were not just her children. They were soldiers. Every stance, every breath, every glance revealed training, discipline, and a mind sharpened for war. He was not sitting with a family. He was sitting in the middle of a military unit. She finally spoke again, her voice carrying the weight of command that echoed off the walls. She asked him why humans believed they could share bonds with those who were forged in battle. He opened his mouth uncertain of the answer, but words came anyway. He said that humans had always built bonds in strange places, even on battlefields, and that trust could grow in the shadows of danger. She tilted her head slightly, but there was no sign of approval, no hint of agreement. Her daughters whispered again, their voices sharp as if cutting into the edges of his courage. The table between them shifted with a sudden hum. The strange tools glowed faintly, rearranging themselves as if alive. He leaned back instinctively, but the woman raised her hand and the objects froze in place. She gestured toward them, her eyes fixed on him, and told him to choose one. He did not know what they were, but he understood this was no simple choice. Each tool looked dangerous, each one pulsed with power he could not understand. His hand hovered over them, and the daughters leaned closer, their expressions tense. Finally, he chose the smallest piece, a shard of crystal no bigger than his palm. He lifted it, its surface warm against his skin, and the faint hum grew louder. The daughters exchanged looks again, as if his choice meant something only they understood. The mother narrowed her eyes, then nodded slightly. She asked why he had chosen the weakest-looking tool. He answered with calm, though inside he shook. He told her that humans had learned long ago that the smallest thing could sometimes hold the greatest strength. Her lips curved faintly, not a smile, but something close. She gestured for him to hold the crystal tight. When he did, the shard flared with light and a vision rushed into his mind. He saw battlefields drenched in fire, alien armies clashing with enemies he could not name, skies torn apart by ships of impossible size. He gasped, pulling his hand back, but the crystal clung to his skin as if alive. The daughters watched with interest, their eyes glowing faintly now as though they were feeding on the same vision. When it ended, the shard dimmed, and he dropped it onto the table with a sharp clang. His chest heaved, his breath uneven. The mother asked what he had seen. He told her the truth, every word, though his voice shook. When he finished, she said nothing, but the silence again spoke more than any words. She had not expected him to endure it. One of the daughters stepped forward then, her movement swift and graceful. She circled him like a predator, her sharp eyes searching every detail of his face, every twitch of his body. She asked him if humans knew what loyalty meant, if they understood sacrifice beyond their own survival. He looked at her, his jaw tight, and said yes. She laughed coldly, the sound sharp in the heavy air, and asked him if he would give his life for them. Strangers from another world. His heart pounded, but he answered without hesitation. He said that humanity had always given life for more than just its own kind, that they had fought for ideas, for futures, for people they barely knew. His words echoed through the chamber, and for a moment the daughters were silent. They looked at one another, their eyes unreadable. The mother leaned forward again, her gaze sharp, and asked if he was speaking truth or just words to survive. He met her eyes and told her it was truth. The air grew heavier, as if the walls themselves leaned closer. He could feel the weight of their judgment pressing down on him. The daughters moved together now, 6 steps in unison, their formation too perfect to be accidental. They stood behind their mother, hands clasped at their sides, their faces carved from stone. The mother looked at him long and hard, then spoke. She told him that he was not here for romance. He was here because they had chosen him for something greater, something dangerous. She explained that her empire was at war, and trust could not be given lightly. Her daughters needed someone who could stand among them, not as a lover, not as a guest, but as a warrior who would not break. His so-called blind date was nothing less than a trial, and his every answer was being measured as proof of whether humanity could be trusted at all. His stomach tightened as her words sank in. He looked at the faces before him, each one sharp, unyielding, each one a test of his worth. He realized the truth. If he failed this trial, he would not walk away alive. And worse, if he failed, it would not just be his death. It would be the death of trust between their people and his. The air grew colder, his pulse quickened, but even as fear pressed at him, another feeling rose within. Resolve. He sat straighter, his voice steady when he spoke. He told her he understood. He told her he would not break. The daughters said nothing, but their eyes flickered with the faintest spark of something new. Respect, or perhaps curiosity. The mother leaned back slowly, her armor shifting with the movement, and for the first time she gave a small nod. The trial was only beginning, but she had seen something in him that made her continue. The hidden motive had revealed itself. This was no date. This was a battlefield dressed in shadows, and he was already standing in the center of it. The air inside the chamber grew colder, as though the walls themselves sensed the shift. The human sat still, his body tense but his eyes unyielding. The alien mother raised her hand slowly, and the 6 daughters stepped forward in perfect unity. Their boots struck the floor with a rhythm that sounded more like drums of war than footsteps. They surrounded him, their tall frames forming a circle, and he realized that the test was no longer spoken. The time for words had ended. The mother's gaze did not soften. She declared in a tone that shook the air that a bond could not be built without blood. If he truly wanted to prove humanity's strength, he would have to survive against those who were born of her line. Her words fell heavy, final, unbreakable. The daughters drew weapons with swift motions, blades that glowed with faint energy, alien steel that hummed like predators hungering for flesh. The man's throat tightened, but he did not rise from his seat. He looked around at the 6 daughters, each of them trained, each of them prepared to strike. He had no weapon, no armor, nothing but his bare hands and his will. He stood slowly, his legs steady though his chest shook inside. He knew he would not win in strength, but perhaps strength was not the only measure they sought. The first daughter lunged without warning. Her blade slashed through the air, but he bent low, the edge barely missing his chest. He rolled across the floor and scrambled back to his feet. She smiled coldly, circling him like a wolf. The others watched in silence, their eyes sharp, waiting for their turn. The mother did not move. Her arms crossed, her expression calm, as though she had seen this test countless times before. The second daughter moved next, her weapon spinning in her hand. She struck with speed too fast for the eye to follow. He blocked with his arm, pain tearing through him as the blade sliced his skin, but he did not cry out. He staggered but remained standing, his eyes locked on hers. She tilted her head slightly, perhaps surprised, perhaps intrigued that he had not fallen. The third and fourth daughters stepped in together. Their coordination was flawless, attacks coming from both sides. He ducked one strike, twisted away from the other, and used the momentum to push one into the other. The two stumbled for only a breath, but in that breath he saw something change. They no longer looked at him with scorn. They looked at him with curiosity, but his body was weakening. Blood dripped from his arm, sweat stung his eyes, and his chest heaved for breath. He knew he could not last forever. He had to show them something greater than endurance. He had to show them the human spirit. The fifth daughter advanced, her weapon raised high. He had no chance to dodge. Instead, he stepped forward, closing the distance before her blade could fall. He grabbed her arm, twisted with all his weight, and forced her weapon to the ground. She stared at him in shock, not expecting such reckless courage. For a brief second, his eyes met hers, and he saw the faint spark of respect flicker there. Then came the sixth, the youngest but perhaps the fiercest. She charged with a cry that echoed in the chamber, her blade flashing with light. He could not stop her, he knew it. Yet instead of running, he spread his arms wide, refusing to retreat. Her weapon stopped inches from his throat. Silence followed. Her chest rose and fell with heavy breaths, but she did not strike. Instead, she lowered her blade slowly, her eyes searching his face as though seeing something she had not expected. The circle broke. The six daughters stepped back in unison, their weapons lowered. They turned toward their mother, waiting for her judgment. The man stood there, trembling, blood staining his sleeve, sweat pouring down his face, but he stood tall.
He had not fallen.
He had not begged. He had not broken. The mother rose at last, her armor glinting in the pale light. She walked toward him, her gaze piercing. She stopped only a step away, towering over him, and for the first time she placed her hand on his shoulder. The weight of it was heavy, yet it carried no malice. She spoke, her voice low but filled with command, declaring that he had survived the first trial. But she warned him that survival was not enough. To claim a place among them, he would need to prove more than endurance. He would need to prove sacrifice. Her words sank deep into him, heavier than the pain in his body. He realized this had only been the beginning. The test had shown them his will, but the trials ahead would demand his very soul. The daughters stepped back into their formation, silent, but no longer filled with scorn. Their eyes carried something new now. Not acceptance, not yet, but recognition. They had seen a human face death and refused to bow. They had seen him fight with nothing but courage. And that, in their eyes, meant something. The mother turned and walked back to her place at the head of the chamber. She raised her hand, and the strange tools on the table glowed once more, reshaping themselves into forms he could not name. She spoke again, her words slow, final, and cold. The first trial was complete. The second would begin at dawn. The man stood where he was, his legs weak, his breath ragged, but his eyes burning with new fire. He now understood the truth. This was not only about winning their trust. This was about proving the worth of all humanity through him, and failure would mean more than his death. It would mean the death of hope itself. The chamber was quiet after the clash, but the silence was heavier than before. The human stood with his blood still dripping, the sting of his wounds crawling down his arm, yet his eyes did not break. The alien mother studied him with the sharp calm of a commander who had seen thousands tested, thousands broken, and thousands fail, but this one still stood. Her 6 daughters shifted uneasily, their faces unreadable, but something in their eyes had changed. It was not warmth, it was not kindness, but it was the smallest spark of acknowledgement, and in this place that was worth more than mercy. The mother spoke again, her words drawn like blades from the sheath of her voice. She said that strength alone was hollow, that blood spilled in survival meant nothing if there was no cause behind it. She demanded more than survival. She demanded proof of purpose, proof of sacrifice. She told him that his life had value only if he could give it up for something beyond himself. The daughters stood straighter at her words, for they knew this was the heart of their code. A warrior's life was not for his own survival, but for those who came after. The man listened, his body aching, his pulse heavy, and yet his mind turned over her words again and again. His life had been many things, ordinary struggles, human fears, mistakes, and victories that would never echo beyond his small world. And now here he was, in the middle of an alien trial, asked to prove not just his strength but his worth as a symbol of humanity. His thoughts burned with the weight of it. He could no longer think of this as his trial alone. Every action would echo, every answer would stand not for himself but for all of his kind. The mother raised her hand and the walls around them shifted with a deep groan. The chamber unfolded like a machine waking from long slumber, and the floor opened into a pit of light. From the pit rose figures, not alive but not lifeless either. Soldiers made of metal and shadow, training constructs built to fight without mercy. Their eyes glowed faint, their bodies moved with mechanical precision, and they carried weapons of war. The daughters did not flinch. The human, however, felt his chest tighten. He had faced living blades, but this was different. These were not family, not bound by judgment or curiosity. These were machines designed only to kill. The mother's voice cut the air once more. She told him that he would face the constructs, not for his own survival, but for the safety of the daughters. If he faltered, they would fall with him. If he failed, their blood would stain the floor beside his. This was the measure of sacrifice. Could he fight when the cost was not his life, but the lives of others? Could he stand when failure meant not his end alone, but the end of those who looked to him? The pit opened fully, and the constructs stepped forward, their metal limbs striking the ground with a sound like thunder. The man's body screamed for rest, but his mind screamed louder, refusing to give in. He moved to stand before the daughters, his arms raised, his breath heavy, but his stance unbroken. For the first time, their eyes widened. He was not running. He was not hiding. He was standing as a shield. The first construct lunged, its weapon flashing. He grabbed a shard from the table, a piece of broken crystal left behind from the earlier trial. It was no sword, no spear, but he wielded it with desperate force, striking the machine's arm and forcing it back. The daughters stepped forward instinctively, but he raised his hand to stop them. His voice, rough but steady, told them that if this was his test, he would bear it. Their eyes met his, and for a heartbeat something unspoken passed between them. He fought with fury, born not of skill but of resolve. Each blow from the machines rattled his bones, each strike sent pain tearing through his body. But he pushed back again and again. He used every ounce of human unpredictability, ducking, twisting, turning what looked like weakness into sudden defiance. When a machine raised its blade to strike one of the daughters, he threw himself into its path, the edge tearing his flesh but sparing her. She stared at him in stunned silence, unused to anyone stepping into harm for her sake. The battle dragged on, every moment heavier than the last. His body failed him piece by piece, his strength fading, his blood spilling, his vision narrowing. Yet still he stood, still he fought, and when the final construct raised its weapon high, the man shouted with a voice that seemed too large for one broken body. He hurled himself forward, driving the shard deep into the machine's core. The construct shuddered, sparked, and fell in silence. The chamber was still. His chest rose and fell like a storm, his wounds bled freely, but he stood upright before the daughters, his arms spread wide as if to shield them from anything else that dared come. The daughters did not mock him now. Their gazes burned with something far different. They had seen warriors in their lives, endless warriors forged by their empire. But this was the first time they had seen someone fight not for glory, not for duty, but for others who had once wished him dead. The mother approached slowly, her armor whispering with each step. She looked down at him, her eyes unblinking, her face carved of steel. Then for the first time she lowered her head in the faintest nod. She told him that sacrifice was the language her kind understood most deeply, and he had spoken it without hesitation. He had bled not for himself but for her daughters, and that made him more than a guest. That made him dangerous. That made him worthy. The daughters stood behind him now, their formation broken not out of weakness but out of something new. They no longer looked at him as prey. They no longer looked at him as a test. They looked at him as one who had stood beside them, even when death had stretched its hand. Respect had entered the air, sharp and undeniable. The man swayed on his feet, his body broken but his spirit blazing. He knew this was not the end. He knew more trials waited. But in that moment, for the first time, he was not alone in the chamber. The chamber no longer felt like a place of death, but neither did it feel safe. The air carried weight, the walls hummed with unseen energy, and the man could taste iron on his tongue as he stood there wounded yet unbroken. The alien mother remained still, her tall frame lit by the glow of the fading machines, her gaze sharp as a blade pressed against his throat. Her 6 daughters moved behind her once again, their discipline intact, but their eyes no longer carried scorn. They carried something heavier, something he had earned, respect bound in silence. The mother raised her hand and the floor of the chamber shifted once more. This time it was not weapons or machines that emerged. It was an illusion that swallowed the room whole. The walls dissolved into shadows and light, and suddenly he stood not in a chamber but on a battlefield. Fires burned in the distance, armies clashed in endless waves, skies split with lightning and the roar of ships thundered above. The scent of ash filled his lungs. He staggered dizzy, but he understood. This was not memory. This was the final trial. The mother's voice echoed across the battlefield, calm and heavy. She told him the last test was simple. He would command her daughters. He would lead them through the chaos. If he failed, the illusion would consume him body and soul. If he succeeded, the bond would be forged in fire. His breath caught in his chest. He had never been a leader of armies, never been trained in alien war. Yet the weight of command now rested on his shoulders. He looked back at the 6 daughters, their eyes locked on him, waiting for orders. The ground shook as the enemy appeared, shapes born of shadow and steel, faceless but endless. Their march rattled the earth, their weapons flashing with cruel light. The daughters raised their blades without hesitation. Their bodies coiled for battle, yet they did not move until he did. For the first time, their fate was tied to his. He clenched his fists, his wounds screaming, his mind spinning. And then he stepped forward. He shouted for them to spread wide, to use their speed, to strike the flanks. They moved as one, their discipline flawless, and the Shadow Army clashed with them in a storm of sparks and screams. He did not stay behind. He threw himself into the fray, his hands grabbing whatever weapon the illusion placed within reach. His body moved with desperation, his voice shouting commands, his mind searching for paths through chaos. The daughters adapted to his words. They struck with precision where he directed, their blades cutting deep, their movements weaving with his. He saw their doubt fade piece by piece as he stood in the front with them, as he fought not as commander above but as shield beside. Each order carried weight not because of authority but because of trust earned in blood. But the battle thickened. For every shadow that fell, 2 more rose. The daughters began to falter under the endless waves. He saw one stumble, her blade knocked away. Without thinking, he hurled himself across the fire, tackling the enemy that threatened her. Pain ripped through his chest, but he forced the creature down, his fist striking until it dissolved into smoke. He pulled her up, his breath ragged, his words sharp. Stand, fight, do not fall. She stared at him in silence before nodding once and returning to the fray with new fury. The mother's voice carried across the battlefield again. She told him that this was the moment that defined worth. Would he choose to save himself when the tide was hopeless? Or would he remain in the storm when death was certain? His throat tightened, his lungs burned, but his answer came not in words, but in action. He charged forward again, his body a broken vessel, but his spirit a roaring flame. The illusion twisted, testing him with horrors greater than before. Towers fell. Fires closed in. Shadows rose larger than mountains. Yet every time he staggered, every time he felt his knees bend, he thought not of escape, but of the six who stood with him. He thought of their eyes, sharp and waiting, and he thought of the silent judgment that had hung over him since the first moment. He would not run. He would not abandon. He would burn with them if that was the price. The daughters fought harder now, their movements fierce and unyielding. They no longer looked to him with doubt. They followed his words, his courage, his defiance. Together they struck. Together they held the line. Together they carved through the endless tide. The battlefield screamed. The skies tore apart, and still he stood at the center, his voice carrying above the chaos, commanding, fighting, refusing to fall. And then the illusion broke. The battlefield faded. The fires dimmed. The shadows dissolved into mist. The chamber returned around them, quiet and cold once more. He stood there trembling, his body close to collapse but still upright. The daughters lowered their weapons slowly, their breaths heavy, their faces pale with exhaustion. Yet their eyes shone with something undeniable. They no longer saw him as an intruder. They no longer saw him as prey. They saw him as one of their own. The mother walked forward, her steps echoing in the silence. She stood before him, towering, unyielding, yet her gaze softer than before. She said he had faced the trial not as a man seeking love, but as a warrior carrying others on his back. She declared that he had passed where countless others would have fallen. He had not only survived, he had commanded, protected, and sacrificed. Her daughters knelt as one, their heads bowed. The man stood, bewildered, broken, but he understood the weight of what he saw. This was no date, no chance meeting. This was the forging of a bond written in blood and trial. He had been chosen not to win a heart, but to win trust that could alter the fate of empires. The mother's hand rose once more, but this time it did not carry judgment. It carried something rarer, something heavier. She placed it on his chest, over his wounded heart, and declared that from this moment forward, his life was bound to theirs. The chamber seemed to breathe, the silence deeper than ever as the truth settled into him. His blind date had begun as a trap, but it had ended as destiny. And destiny, he now knew, was far deadlier than love.